The occult researcher levered a rusted iron bar beneath the corroded stone slab and felt the mortar give with a wet crack. Suspicion tightened his jaw and pushed his palms harder. The slab shifted, then toppled with a dull, muffled echo into the dark. A single candle guttered against a windless opening as the night watcher leaned forward, voice thin. "Is it empty?" The pile of burnt cord, the scorched altar, and an empty loop of rope met them like evidence of an action already completed. The immediate question was who had vanished, and why the cult had sworn to forget the ritual S-name. That concrete discovery, an empty loop, braided cords, an altar stained and still warm, set the stake. There was either an explanation in ink and object or a secret the archive would kill to keep. The occult researcher did not wait for permission. He dropped into the aperture and dragged a hand over the altar's blackened edge, tasting ash on his fingertips. He paused to record it, pen moving in measured strokes, because his suspicion had become method. Every burned thread, every abrasion on the stone could be turned into a traceable fact. He handed the notebook up to the night watcher. "Mark the scorch here," he said. 12 inches from the sigil. The night watcher repeated the measurement aloud and scribbled. Their exchange held tension. The watcher kept glancing at the doorway, as if expecting someone to arrive and stop them. They carried the artifacts out in silence to the chapel courtyard. The ceramic candle cup fit into a gloved palm with residue that flaked like black paint. Marta the conservator arrived before dawn, breath visible in the cold air. "Hands already in nitrile gloves. Show me where," she said. Marta's voice was direct and utilitarian. She did not ask why they had forced a slab. She catalogued the pendant and turned it under the lantern light. The pendant at its serrated edge held granules of ash and a faint, glossy residue that caught the flame. Her fingers found a minuscule burn pattern along the inner curve. "This matches the text," she said, and the watcher's shoulders tightened. They moved next to the attic study where the last scribe waited with a brittle folio in his lap. The folio smelled of foxed paper and old glue. The last scribe's hands shook when he opened it. "They named it once," he said, voice guarded, "and they agreed to name nothing again." The researcher listened and leaned over the book, eyes scanning a line of cramped script that annotated an apparatus and a verb that could be performed on a human body and not reversed. The researcher read aloud a phrase the scribe hesitated to pronounce. The scribe's fingers closed on a marginal note and he tapped the page. "They crossed it out themselves," he said. Doubt made the researcher slow his pace. He revisited the chapel at midday to search for administrative records that might explain the disappearance. At the municipal archive, the high custodian met him in a corridor lined with sealed cabinets. "You have no clearance for those files," the custodian said without looking up. His tone combined institutional certainty and a private, practiced irritation. "Those records are sealed by decree." The researcher placed his palm flat on a cabinet and named the parchment he sought. The custodian's jaw tightened. "We will not be responsible for what you do with that knowledge." The high custodian. The researcher pushed back. "If a human was altered and hidden, that is not an institutional secret. It is evidence. I only want to document it." The custodian cited regulations in a patient, automatic cadence. The argument escalated into quick exchanges. "You will break rules if you go into that chapel tonight," the high custodian warned. "You will drag us into legal trouble." Marta from behind the researcher, pragmatic and blunt. The researcher looked at Marta and the night watcher and felt the first real push toward decision. His suspicion had shifted into a practical choice about risk. Marta folded a small swab into a vial and said, "If the authority won't open their books, we take physical proof." The researcher nodded. They returned after dusk. The ruin's doorway chewed the light into a narrow slit as the three of them moved like a small, deliberate force. Marta carried a box of conservation tools. The night watcher kept a light low and angled to reveal texture. The researcher felt a colder, sharper sensation, fear, when he stepped into the inner antechamber and saw recent footprints in ash that led to the altar and then out again. The footprints were not old. Fresh ash still held the ridge lines of a sole. He crouched and pressed a finger into a depression and felt how the ash collapsed beneath pressure. Someone came back, he whispered. Marta's breath made a short sound, or they never left entirely, she said. Her hands worked on the serrated pendant with a small brush. The researcher felt the shift in their roles. Marta and the night watcher were no longer assistants. They had become partners whose small decisions carried consequence. He kept his voice low. We need to photograph the robe, he said. We need to sample what lies beneath it. The robe hung above the altar, frayed at the hem and blackened in streaks. The circle of scorched floor beneath it held a faintly glowing sigil in faded gold leaf. Marta moved first. Stand back, she said, and unhooked a loop of wire. Her gloved fingers shook when she brushed aside the robe. Underneath lay a preserved remnant wrapped in cloth, an object that was neither clearly corpse nor living flesh, but a deliberately arrested form. The researcher reached forward and did not touch it at first. His palms went flat on the altar to steady himself. The remnant had skin that had the shine of polished hide and a cartilaginous hinge that did not belong to ordinary anatomy. Up close, the surface bore careful incision lines sealed with resin. Marta exhaled and her shoulders slumped. This was made, not born, she said. The researcher read the scribe, the marginalia again in his mind, a verb applied to a person to change their relation to ordinary life. That line, read in the light of the remnant, no longer looked like abstract liturgy. It looked like an applied technique. He crouched and photographed a burn pattern, then swabbed an edge and labeled the vial. We have material proof, he said. The night watcher swallowed and said, then why did they swear to forget? The researcher did not have an immediate answer. Instead, he catalogued the object's bindings and the robes weaved to build a chain of custody. Dawn arrived as they worked. They had not noticed the time pass. The high custodian returned with 2 emissaries and a legal brief held like a shield. He moved through the doorway with a practiced indignation. You have no right to carry out these actions, he said. The emissaries spread a line of paper across the altar like an attempt to claim the physical space. The researcher looked at the custodian and did not step back. You can take the objects under seal, he said, or we document them now and publish the record. The custodian's mouth thinned. A rapid exchange followed. You were warned, the custodian said. We will press charges for trespass. You can arrest facts, Marta replied. You can only hide them. You will force me to act, the custodian said, and you will force me to publish, the researcher shot back. The night watcher interrupted with a single line. We found footprints leading away from the altar last night. The custodian changed tack, his voice colder. Then the site is contaminated. We will handle contamination protocols. No photographs leave this building. The argument stretched into 6 quick lines of barbed, administrative retort and counter. The researcher saw the institution's fear, not of legal risk, but of what public knowledge would do to their authority. They resolved a partial compromise. The custodian left with a promise to seal the site pending tribunal. The researcher kept copies of photographs in his notebook and hid the labeled vials inside a false, bottomed case Marta prepared. He felt the weight of a decision harden. Either he exposed the remnant and broke the archive's shield, or he allowed a powerful body to obscure a physical, testable result. The motive behind the secrecy had moved from theological shame to institutional self-preservation. That afternoon the researcher visited the last scribe again, this time pushing for specificity. Who attended the rite? He asked. The scribe chewed the end of his quill and gave names in clipped phrases. A stewarded inner circle, 3 elders, 1 outsider delivered at the threshold. The researcher wrote each name. Why forget? He asked. The scribe folded his hands, because forgetting protects those who remain. Because some transformations are dangerous to admit, the researcher felt doubt return. Was the secrecy meant to protect survivors or to conceal deliberate harm? Late in the day, Marta fed a sample into a portable spectrometer on a bench in her temporary lab. The readout showed anomalous compounds, combustion residues mixed with an organic polymer not found in typical funerary kits. Marta tapped the screen. These binders are synthesized, she said, not natural decomposition. Someone manufactured the arresting material. The researcher felt another shift. Suspicion had moved from the ritual's abstract power to a practical reality of manufacture and procurement. He marked her about provenance, and she replied, "The alloy filings match a smithing technique used in 2 villages on the western ridge." He wrote the village names in his notebook. Night came again, and they prepared to return to the chapel. The researcher felt an ache at his teeth, a physical fatigue that sharpened his decisions. He rechecked the sealed vials, the photographs, the chain of custody notes, and the folio marginalia that the last scribe had agreed to let him copy. If we expose this, who will believe us? The night watcher. The researcher thought of the custodian's confident denials and of the robe's suspended emptiness above the altar. He answered with a step he had rehearsed alone. "We will show the evidence exactly as it is. We will show the remnant, the artifacts, the text." The night watcher breathed out slow and steady. They reopened the antechamber at midnight. The doorway admitted a thin column of moonlight that picked out new details. A second, smaller scorched circle near the altar and a set of prints that approached the robe in a hesitant arc. The researcher crouched and pressed a small piece of frosted film to the floor to lift one print. He handed it to Marta. "Keep that aside," he said. "Compare it to regional soul patterns." Marta nodded and placed it into evidence. She looked at him. "This was not just a rite," she said. "Someone had to be trained to perform those cuts and resin seals." The researcher felt resolve harden. They documented the remnant with a completeness that would survive institutional suppression. Scale photos, microscopic scrapes, threaded sampling of robe fibers, and a swab from the pendant's inner curve. Each motion was concrete and purposeful. They treated the chamber as a crime scene rather than a theatrical stage. The night watcher read aloud a line from the folio as the researcher annotated the margins. "The initiate is unbound from ordinary kin and placed into permanent threshold." The night watcher lowered his voice. "Permanent," he repeated. The word landed like a verdict. At the altar the remnant gave up one more secret. Under the cloth, wrapped in a folded scrap of ceremonial linen, they found a token. A small brass lapel pin stamped with an Ouroboros and an initial. The researcher recognized the pin from an administrative roster photograph he had seen months before. He held it up. "This belongs to Elder Hargreave," he said. "He sits on the municipal council." Marta's fingers tightened around her tweezers. "So they used civic officials," she said. The implication reoriented the conflict. This was not only an arcane act, but a political act, an initiated removal that implicated named rulers. They left the chapel at dawn with evidence enough to force public scrutiny. The custodian had already prepared a formal injunction, but the researcher had copies and the night watcher had sworn statements. They moved with a sense of escalation. Their discovery had changed the power balance between scholar and institution. They had forced the question of who decides what the community may remember. 2 earlier assumptions collapsed: that the rite belonged solely to a vanished cult, and that forgetting was a communal, apolitical choice. Back in his study, the researcher set the remnant under a controlled light and began the slow work of transcription. He threaded the folios marginalia into a narrative that would hold up under scrutiny. Names, dates, procedural steps, and the material evidence they had gathered. He wrote the word "permanent" in the margin and placed a small strip of adhesive over it. He sealed a loose note inside the folio, a directive to open only if legal counsel allowed. He felt that same unease as earlier, fear that publication would harm people, but also a different sensation. A responsibility to preserve facts rather than let them be smothered by protocol. The final act of the chapter was a precise movement. He folded the folio, slid the sealed note into its inner binding, and fastened a small brass pin through the cover to hold it closed. His hands were steady now, but his throat tightened and he paused, listening for any sound from the hall. A footfall on the stair would change everything. He heard a distant scrape, wood shifting below, and then the faint turn of a key in the lock. He lowered himself into the chair, closed the desk, and slid the drawer shut with the folio inside. The key turned again. The study door opened from the corridor, and a single knock fell on the inner door. The chapter closes on that concrete beat. A knock at the study door, not a reflection or a promise. The immediate conflict is resolved here. For now they have the evidence. The archive has the power to obstruct. The final scene leaves a decision pending and a recorded consequence. The researcher knows the remnant cannot be undone, and someone knows he holds proof. The story will continue, but this chapter ends with the sound of the key and the knock that will force the next move. He forced the brittle folio open and found the final page gone, a smear of ash, and a single human hair caught in the binding. Suspicion tightened his jaw and moved his hands with more force. The occult researcher brushed ash into the palm of his gloves and kept his eyes on the empty edge where a page once sat. The vault's air tasted of cold stone and old glue. He muttered, "Mara, look at this," and the archivist stepped forward without hesitation. Within the first 4 sentences, the problem was visible and urgent. Someone had erased the ceremonious conclusion from the archive, and the missing end altered the entire rite's meaning. He had opened a sealed volume because of the slab he had toppled in the previous investigation. The memory of that rusted iron bar and the corroded stone slab, the damp crack when the mortar gave, sat in his mind like a reference point. The night watcher's seal broken, a candle guttered against a windlass opening. He touched the margin where glue had once bound paper and felt a smear of powder under his fingernail. Suspicion directed his immediate choices. He called for light, for photographs, for the archive seals to be noted, and he kept his voice small and controlled to avoid disturbing other documents. Archivist Mara pressed her palm to the folio's edge and said, "They removed it cleanly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Her voice was steady. The occult researcher watched her face. Mara's mouth tightened, and she tapped the folio twice as if testing for hidden staples. Doubt arrived as a second emotion, doubt about who within the monastery could touch restricted folios. He felt the shift in his own posture, from methodical curiosity to guarded calculation. The room registered as specific facts. The vault's iron grate under a narrow lens of lamplight, a damp shadow along the mortar, the archivist's breath leaving small fogs in the cold. The occult researcher ordered the folio moved to the conservator's bench and asked Mara to list anyone who had accessed the volume in the last year. Mara gave names without flair. Council reading 2 months past, Brother Hild, Conservator Ansel last week for repair, and the caretaker passed through twice last month. Each name rearranged his hypothesis. Each rearrangement forced a new action. He photographed the binding, swabbed the ash into an evidence pot, and set a small strip of red wax across the folio's edge to mark the breach. They carried the folio to the conservator's slab. Conservator Ansel worked with a lamp that burned yellow and steady, his hands practiced and careful. "I can trace a watermark." Ansel while setting a loop over the folio's spine. He placed the folio beneath a soft light and tilted it until a pattern showed faintly through the paper. The occult researcher watched Ansel's fingers press where the page had split and listened as Ansel murmured measurements and watermark codes into a small recorder. Suspicion deepened into determination. The researcher decided to pair the physical trace with testimony. He needed someone who had been present at the time of the rite. He drove to a rain-darkened cottage on the ridge because the folios marginalia had a single name, Edda. The former initiate opened the door before he could knock twice. Edda stood with sleeves rolled, a healed but jagged scar running from cheekbone to jaw, and she pushed a burned locket across the table with 2 fingers. "I won't name the final gesture, Edda, but I carry it every day." Her voice had a clipped, even cadence. The researcher placed the locket on the table and probed. "Edda, who carried you out?" She looked at him and answered clearly, "No one." I walked myself from the threshold. That line changed the direction of his questioning. It implied the rite's claim of irreversibility was not symbolic. Edda's hands trembled when she set the locket down. The researcher noted the trimmer and how she avoided the window. He specific, concrete questions about the night, the floor of the threshold chamber, the blade used, the cloth that bound hands. She described a serrated pendant, the way Candle's suit had etched into the floor, the exact cadence of the words spoken. Her description matched details from the folio's earlier leaves. Someone erased the ending, she said, meeting Mara's eyes when the archivist arrived at the cottage later. Someone tried to make it look like it never happened. The researcher's doubt shifted again into alarm. The possibility of recent tampering made him accelerate his tests. Back in the conservator's lab, Ansel held a small serrated pendant with tweezers. The pendant's teeth were fine, each serration carrying a blackened residue. This sat in ash, Ansel reported, watching the loop. He angled it and found a micro, itching under a rim. He passed the pendant to Mara and said, "Look where the light bites the metal." Mara traced the micro, etching with a gloved fingertip, and felt the ridge of the watermark impressed into the shape. "This matches the Folios watermark, Mara." Her voice rose by a syllable. The room contracted around that sound. She pushed back from the table and accused. Someone moved a page from the archive and used it as a template. That was an accusation spoken into cold air. It landed on the researcher like a physical object. A confrontation followed in the hall outside the council chamber. A caretaker acolyte blocked the corridor with a faded warrant, clutched to his chest, and demanded the pendant be handed over. "You do not have authority here." The occult researcher held the pendant in a small evidence bag and answered, "We have reason to suspect evidence was removed from the folio. We are cataloguing it." The acolyte's knuckles went pale around the warrant. He pushed forward, and Mara stepped between them. The argument burst into 6 short lines of dialogue that snapped like a blade. "Mara, give it." The acolyte. "No, Mara, you cannot. You don't own the archive," Mara replied. "I have the warrant." The acolyte. "This is evidence." The researcher. The exchange forced a physical scramble. The acolyte tried to seize the bag. Mara tightened her grip. The pendant jerked against cloth and sent a sliver of ash across the corridor floor. The acolyte's face flushed. The researcher interposed his body and felt a quick, sharp strain in his shoulder as he pushed Mara back toward the lab. The fight lasted barely 30 seconds but redefined authority in the archive. Hands that had long managed the chapel and its rituals suddenly stood opposed to hands that managed books and truth. The researcher recorded every movement and every line of dialogue in his notebook with short, pragmatic strokes. At night, in a damp antechamber beneath the archive, Edda sat with the pendant on her palm. The caretaker acolyte remained in the doorway, his warrant unread on the table, his breath shallow. The right was only once Edda, and the words held a hard, brittle quality. She pushed the pendant toward the acolyte and added, "Someone tried again, last week." There were fresh scorch marks on the north lintel. The researcher rose and moved to the lintel with a lamp. He measured scorch depth, counted the concentric hairline cracks in the plaster, and photographed the black rings. That external discovery changed the scene. What had been an isolated breach became an active attempt to weaponize irreversibility. The revelation made the researcher change tactics. Suspicion and doubt had already guided him. Now action shifted to containment. "We document, we seal, we notify council." Mara answered, "Notify who?" "The council abrogates when secrets are safe." Her hands worked at a small strip of red wax. The caretaker acolyte's jaw tightened. "I was warned to keep this between the order," he said. The room held a pulse of tension where allegiance collided with archival duty. Emotion shifted from alarm to urgency. They returned to the altar room at midnight because the evidence demanded it. The initiatory threshold chamber smelled of old oil and burnt linen. The marble threshold bore a faint, gilded sigil, its edges dark with soot. The researcher found fresh footprints in the dust, small, half-formed strikes that suggested someone had hurried and then faltered. He marked each print with numbered chalk and photographed them. The caretaker acolyte stared at the prints and said, "I did not make those." "Those are recent." His voice was a low, flat line. Edda stood at the threshold, fingers spread against cold stone, and said nothing for several beats. Her silence carried as much meaning as speech. The climax arrived when the caretaker acolyte reached for a ceremonial blade that had been set against the threshold, and Edda stepped forward to take it. Movement condensed into a short sequence. The acolyte's hand lifting, Edda's fingers closing, the researcher stepping between them and saying, "Wait." The blade flashed under the lamplight. The researcher felt the ritual's rhythm arrayed in front of him. The wrong player attempting the sequence, the wrong cadence of gestures, the risk of irreversible consequence. He could not physically stop what two trained hands might accomplish if they completed the sequence. He had only one concrete action available: to enact the documented order of gestures from the partial folio and force the ritual into a known form so that its outcome would be contained. He recited the lines he had transcribed earlier and placed his hands on the threshold in the precise positions. His voice was measured and controlled. Hold the blade. He told the acolyte, count the beat. Stop on my mark. The acolyte's fingers trembled, but he complied. Edda's scarred jaw clenched while she kept hold of the blade. The room's sound narrowed to breathing, the rasp of cloth, and the faint tick of the conservator's clock beyond the paneling. The researcher directed gestures with brief commands. Here, press the edge. Now the knot. Now the inversion. Each instruction was a physical step, each step aligned with a line in his notebook. The ritual sequence began inside his hands and the two others' bodies rather than in the unseen domain where the archive lost its page. Emotion shifted from urgency to strained control. Halfway through the sequence, a small, unforeseen motion altered the outcome. The acolyte hesitated for a fraction too long, and Edda tightened her grip in response. The researcher felt a sharp pull against the rhythm and realized the folio had been altered. A missing conjunctive beat that, if omitted, produced a different closure. He had to decide immediately whether to stop and force an incomplete gesture or to replace the missing beat with his best reconstruction. He chose reconstruction. He slotted in the missing movement with a short, precise pressure of his thumb against the carved sigil and spoke the reconstructed syllable. The acolyte exhaled, Edda's shoulders loosened, and the blade pressed into the threshold with a clean, metallic click. Something occurred then that nobody could have predicted. The altar's scorched coal burst into a thin ribbon of smoke that curled and hung over the sigil. The robe suspended above the altar sucked tight at the waist, as if wind had passed through it, and a faint pulse of gold flared beneath the ash. The researcher saw the fabric tremble, heard the rasp of stitching give, and felt immediately the weight of irreversible change. He had acted to contain the act, and his action had become entangled with its consequence. He registered the event concretely. A thread snapped at the robe's seam, leaving a black unravel that dropped to the floor and smoldered. The room smelled briefly of hot metal and old incense. At dawn, the researcher and Mara inspected the scorched altar. The robe hung ruined, its hem burned, and under the ash a faint gold sigil pulsed with slow, shallow light as if a low heartbeat had been trapped beneath dust. Mara crouched and touched the sigil's edge with the tip of a glove and withdrew her hand with a soft, surprised exhale. "It's active," she said. "Something finished here." The researcher photographed the sigil and swabbed residue into a specimen jar. They compared the jar's label to the evidence from the folio and pendant. The items matched. The micro-etching, the watermark, the residue. They converged into a single material proof that an irreversible act had occurred and that someone else had tried to reproduce it. They sat in the archive study when early sun slanted through a small window. The researcher opened his notebook and drew a new marginal note next to the folio's catalogue number. A tight hand, a small arrow with a puncture at one point, and a line linking the pendant to the scorch marks. He traced the margin with a stained fingertip and wrote, "Weaponized possibility. Follow Conservator Ansel's records." Check the caretaker's warrant logs. He paused and tapped the brass Ouroboros lapel pin on his coat twice. The pause was not empty. It carried a choice. Pursue the lead and risk further interference, or seal the trail and bury the evidence in the archive's protective layers. He chose pursuit. After a long beat, the door to the study opened. The caretaker acolyte stood in the threshold with the warrant in his hand and said, "You will notify the council now." His voice had settled into something hard. The researcher looked up and answered, "We will notify the council. We will include all evidence." Mara closed the folio and placed the red wax-pressed seal over its spine. The researcher slid his notebook across the table and tapped the marginalia he had just made. He Follow the chain. Start with Ansel S. logs, then the caretaker S. sign, in book, then the brother who read the volume. The acolyte nodded once and left without further argument. Before the researcher packed his lamp, he took one last photograph of the damaged robe and angled the shot so the faint gold sigil showed beneath ash. He uploaded the image, wrote a single line in the notebook, "Edda verified, attempted repeat, evidence sealed but active. Continue." He snapped the notebook shut and felt the small, precise weight of the brass pin. He had turned private horror into a methodical vow. He would trace the mechanism beneath the right rather than let rumor shape it. That decision hardened the chapter's final movement. Outside, a courier arrived with a thin envelope from Conservator Ansel. The envelope contained a tiny, folded note. A ledger entry noting a late night repair to a metal case 2 nights before the attempt on the threshold. The researcher unfolded it, read the date and time, and crossed that time against the acolyte's pad. The times did not match. He folded the note and slid it into his notebook where the Ouroboros was drawn. Mara watched him and said, "They protected a secret and then someone reached for it." He answered with a single nod and then wrote the next line. "Pursue in person. Do not send intermediaries." He put on his wool coat, adjusted his spectacles, and left the study to follow the next narrow trail. He closed the latter with a small, practical action. He tapped the page twice and pushed the brass pin across the desk, where the margin marks glowed faintly under the lamp. The last sentence of the chapter is not reflection but movement. A step out into the rain toward a conservator's workshop, whose ledger entries would either clear the archive or deepen the suspicion already lodged there. The chapter ends on that concrete beat, his hand on the latch, as he left the study to confront records, a deliberate choice that pushed the investigation forward. He stepped through the narrow doorway and yanked the lantern low. The last acolyte flinched, fingers still unwinding a braided cord from a soot-dark bundle. Suspicion tightened his jaw and pushed him forward. He kept the lantern between them and watched the acolyte's hands move with protective speed. "What are you doing?" The occult researcher, voice steady and slow. The acolyte froze, the braided cord slipping free and revealing a wrapped object the size of a thumb. The problem was immediate and concrete. Someone had touched the rite's final instrument, and a living custodian still tended its remnants. He had come expecting dust and absence. Instead, he found a person who had not yet let the rite die. The first 5 sentences of the encounter contained action, names, and the stake. An active confrontation over objects tied to irreversible consequences. The researcher's suspicion, and then a quick shift toward cautious curiosity, governed each step he took. He kept his hands visible, the way he had when he first pried the corroded slab from the crypt. That memory iron bar, wet crack, a single guttering candle, sat behind his teeth like grit. He had read the brittle folio, had felt the empty edge where the final page had been torn away and found ash and a single hair caught in the binding. That concretely missing page had been the reason for this late night drive to the chapel. "You untee that and you risk everything," the researcher said. His voice contained a measured command. It aimed to test the last acolyte. The acolyte blinked and pressed the bundle closer. "You do not know what it sings," the acolyte answered, and his words were small but steady. Suspicion shifted to doubt in the researcher's face. Had the ceremony's danger been misread? Or had someone been protecting a truth that altered the stakes? The doubt moved him forward into a different posture. He needed proof, not stories. Caretaker Mera's footsteps approached from the chapel threshold, an urgent shuffle against stone. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice cut the space between lantern light and dark stone. She held a ceramic lantern of her own and kept it tilted so the flame did not show a full face. Her hands trembled only slightly when she put the lantern down. The trimmer spoke of a long, held fear translated into habit. She had been the one who opened the main door for him last month and kept the keys. Now she stood with the posture of someone deciding whether to shield or surrender a secret. The researcher nodded once to Mira, and then to the acolyte. "Show me the bundle," he said. He moved close enough that he could smell the cord. Braided horsehair braided with thread darker than rope. It smelled faintly of ash and iron. The acolyte set the bundle down on a low stone bench and unwrapped the outer cloth slowly, deliberately. He peeled back layers until the serrated pendant, black metal, edges micro, toothed. A thin line of old, brittle gold caught the lamp flame for the first time. The pendant had the same serration pattern described in the margins of the folio's missing page. Seeing it shifted the researcher's doubt into a careful alarm. The object matched the ritual apparatus, not a later imitation. Cade arrived at the threshold like a sudden gust, boots scuffing the threshold, carrying a scorched folio fragment under one arm and a small velvet pouch in his hand. He slammed the door closed behind him with a force that made the lantern lean. "Cade Mira, you took your time." Cade did not answer. He set the fragment on the bench beside the pendant and pushed it toward the researcher. The scorched page curled at the edges, blackened ink still clinging to letters that formed a name. One line of the text matched the missing folio's script, and the name beneath it suggested a living line of descent. The researcher felt the room narrow as he read the name aloud. "So there's a descendant," he said. His suspicion had transformed again, this time into alarm. The presence of lineage changed the rite from an academic curiosity into an immediate moral danger. Archivist Cade's breath came quick and low. "It was in a private box at the library," he said. "Someone burned a page and threw it away. I salvaged it." His words were clipped. His eyes darted toward the pendant and then to the acolyte. "We should not complete anything here tonight, Mira. We should cover it and call the council." The last acolyte's gaze hardened. "Call the council and the girl dies," he said. "If there are bloodlines, public exposure means trackers. I have kept this secret to protect them." The exchange sharpened into argument. The researcher listened for motives as much as facts. Cade pushed a finger under the curl of the scorched fragment and straightened it enough for the lantern to show a marginal sigil. "The name ties to a baptismal record in the parish register," he said. "That girl may be alive in this county." The instrument was misplaced. Someone kept part of the rite active. He spoke with archivist cadence, precise, economical, the voice of someone used to letting documents do the testimony. The researcher's suspicion hardened into professional urgency. He needed to verify the lineage, to trace the name to a living person, but he also felt the ache of a moral question pressing at him. What responsibility did he hold to a living descendant who might be endangered by his findings? They moved as a group toward the altar, where a small hatch lay, mortared and partially concealed under a rug. The hatch gave under a lever and a dull pop. Stone dust plumed like breath, and the hatch slid aside. The descent into the sanctum was a literal narrowing of options. Air colder, the lights smaller, decisions heavier. The researcher counted the steps by ear as they descended, 3 reverberations per stone. The sanctum smelled of old smoke and beeswax. The chamber beneath the altar had been set for the final sequence. Implements arranged, ash rings, a stained robe folded on an iron hook. The implements matched the folio's diagrams, 3 gestures, a single serrated pendant, and a cord braided from horsehair and human thread. The last acolyte kept touching the pendant with the blunt part of a fingertip. His motion said caretaking, reverence, and an unwillingness to let history be reduced to ink. The researcher took out his notebook, its leather hinge familiar and worn, and wrote a line. He paused between strokes, measuring evidence record. "Implements in situ," he said aloud, the sentence action as much as note. He photographed the pendant and the cord, careful to use no flash that would alter the pigments. Archivist Cade knelt and set the scorched fragment against the pendant so the photographer's frame would show them together. The photograph captured the burned edge next to the serration, a match. The researcher's professional caution stiffened into concrete belief. The rite had been performed, perhaps more recently than anyone wanted to admit. They debated what to do next under the low roof of the sanctum. The last acolyte proposed a demonstration. One small, controlled gesture to prove the rite's claim to irreversible change, a proof that could be observed and recorded. "A single motion," he said, "only the sign. Not the whole thing, one mark." The researcher felt an immediate, visceral shift. Doubt became alarm. Alarm threatened to become compulsion. If the right truly produced an irreversible mark, demonstrating it risked a living person. Mira's mouth tightened. Cade's hands hovered near his pockets. "We can test on the robe," the researcher said. "We can reproduce the gesture on the robe to observe physical reaction without involving a living body." The acolyte's jaw moved. "It will not answer your question," he said. "The rite works on living flesh." The room tightened into a decision point. At that moment a soft rap sounded on the hatch lip, 3 knocks, single pauses. Everyone looked up. The researcher felt the hair at his nape prick. The knock was not an ambient noise but a human arrival. The hatch lifted a crack and a small face peered in. A young woman, ragged coat, a faded baptismal token on a cord at her throat. Her mouth shaped a single word, "Father." Silence snapped through the chamber like a wire. The initiate's daughter climbed down with a steady hand on the hatch rim. She held the token so both the researcher and Cade could see the parish stamp. Her voice was thin with shock. "My name is Lisa," she said. "This is my mother's token. My mother kept this. I came to know what happened to her. Her presence rewired the stakes." The researcher's suspicion recomposed into protective urgency. He stepped forward and offered his hand, not as a greeting, but as a gesture to steady her. "Lisa, you should not be here alone," he said. "Who you about this place?" She looked directly at the last acolyte. "He wrote to me," she said. "Me to come if I wanted to know who my mother really was." The last acolyte's face broke into a brief, private softness. "Lisa," he said, and his voice lost some of its defensive hardness. The researcher watched the exchange and felt an emotional shift from professional detachment into reluctant care. The presence of a living descendant removed hypothetical harm and made the cost of exposure immediate. Mira stepped forward and placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder. "You carry the token," she said, eyes flicking to the pendant and the scorched folio. "You have a right to truth, but truth carries people into danger." The dialogue became a negotiation. Cade rubbed his knuckles and said, "We can trace the line and then anonymize the report. We can publish analysis without names." The last acolyte barked out a short laugh. "Publish. Names will be cross-checked. Trackers will move quicker than papers." The argument produced quick, overlapping lines. 3 to 6 rapid exchanges where motives collided. Their voices shortened into commands and rebuttals. The researcher kept speaking in short sentences, each designed to probe rather than to sway. They chose a test that balanced evidence and caution. The last acolyte would perform a single marking gesture on a scrap of skin from a sacrificial calf hide they found folded under the robe. If a visible sign rippled through the hide and an associated, measurable signal occurred, some described ritual resonance, they would stop. If not, they would disassemble the implements and bury the sanctum. The decision fell to the group, not only to the researcher. The researcher recorded the decision and felt the burden shift into his notebook. Vote for demonstration documented, signatures taken. Cade hesitated but signed. Mira hesitated and signed. The last acolyte signed with a short, resigned stroke. The ceremony began with 3 measured gestures. The last acolyte spoke the fragmentary words from the folio, phonemes that clung to the stone and left a metallic tang in the air. The researcher kept his pen poised and his camera rolling on a tripod. He measured the light and fixed the lens to capture skin detail. When the acolyte made the final motion, the pendant hovered and then touched the hide. A pale line opened across the calf hide where metal met flesh. The line darkened like a bruise and then a thin ridge rose, a raised scar of flesh across treated hide. The room registered the change with a sharp intake of breath. Lisa let out a small sound, not of surprise but of recognition. She had expected the mark and the private memory it unlocked. For the researcher, the demonstration moved from academic test to evidence of a mechanism. The rite produced a permanent physical sign when performed exactly as prescribed. Alarm widened into a new clarity. The rite's claim to irreversible change was not myth. The immediate aftermath brought physical reactions. Mira stepped back and put a hand to her mouth. Cade crouched to inspect the raised ridge and ran his thumb along it as if to find a seam. The last acolyte chuckled once, an odd small sound of grief that did not reach his eyes. Lissa's pupils dilated and she pressed her fingers to her throat where the baptismal token lay. A private sensation passed over her face like recognition of a word on a page. She had not been told the ritual's true measure, and the demonstration produced a private, visceral echo inside her. The researcher documented the entire sequence, noting the rise of the ridge, the timing in seconds, and the way each person's body shifted in response. A new, unexpected link became clear. The scorched fragment contained a line that named a location where the ritual had been completed decades earlier, and a marginal note indicating a single survivor who had borne the mark. The marginal note used a phrase the researcher had seen before in a ledger from the parish, an oblique reference paid in goods rather than money. Cade's hand hovered toward his pocket. The researcher watched and then reached, catching the edge of Cade's sleeve. "Cade," the researcher said softly, "do not move the fragment without telling us." Cade's fingers closed around the paper and then withdrew. "I will not let anyone weaponize it. Cade, not for exposure, not for sale." His face showed tension. The researcher weighed Cade's words against the earlier discovery. The existence of a living descendant made the fragment valuable and dangerous. He felt the emotional shift from scientific clarity to a moral split within the group. One side argued for archival custody and analysis, the other for concealment to shield living people. They carried the implements back up the ladder to the vestibule, where the first pale light of pre-dawn had begun to thin the lantern flames. A quiet argument broke out there, rapid lines fired across a short space as choices hardened into camps. "We bury the implements, Mira. We cover everything and say we found nothing." "No," the researcher said. "We catalog. We place the fragment in controlled custody. We anonymize the descendant and publish context so the ritual cannot be repeated without resources only institutions can muster." The last acolyte stepped between them. "You will not put our people at risk with your papers," he said. "You think institutions protect." They also exposed the accordion of quick dialogue tightened into the required confrontation. 3 to 6 short back and forth lines where both sides stated their positions and rebutted. Cade moved his hand into his pocket and, in a motion that the researcher failed to stop, palmed the scorched fragment. It was small, burned, stiffened, and thin enough to disguise in a fist. The researcher felt the motion and lunged, but Cade's elbow slid past his reach. "Cade," the researcher said, and the word was both command and question. Cade stepped away and tucked the fragment deeper into his coat. "I am protecting it, Cade. If I cannot trust you to shield names, I will hide it." Betrayal threaded through the sentence. Mira's mouth formed the word betrayal silently. The last acolyte swore under his breath. Cade left before any vote could be forced. He walked out into the grey dawn with the fragment concealed against his chest. The researcher shouted after him. Lisa ran to the threshold and called his name. Cade did not answer. The betrayal reconfigured the group's ability to control the evidence. The researcher felt a new emotion arise, frustrated resolve. He could not force Cade back, but he could control what he himself would do with the material he had recorded. They had a final conversation before Cade vanished down the lane. It lasted 8 short sentences, each a probe. "Mira, do we bury the implements now?" The last acolyte insisted. "We seal the sanctum and keep the location in living memory alone." Lisa touched the pendant and said, "I want to know my mother's story. I do not want others to pick at that wound." The researcher listened and then made a concrete decision. He would not publish identifying names or the precise mechanics of the rite. He would write a clinical account of the implements and their effects, include measured photographs of the pendant and the marked hide, and then deposit the evidence in a sealed research trust accessible only under strict oversight. He recorded his decision in the notebook and then read it aloud so all present could hear the obligation he set for himself. "I will redact names and deposit copies with restricted access," he said. "I will not publish anything that would allow replication by bad actors." The room accepted the pronouncement with small movements, nods, a thumb rubbing a lip, and then they acted to fulfill it. They sealed the sanctum as best they could, implements wrapped in oilcloth, photographs logged with timestamps, the robe folded and placed beneath a stone. The last acolyte took the robe in his hands for a long time and then, in front of them all, hung it on a peg above the altar. He closed his fingers around the peg's iron ring and breathed, a short sound that suggested farewell rather than defeat. Lisa stepped forward and touched the robe's hem with the pad of a finger. She did not cry aloud. Instead, she made a single recorded statement into the researcher's device. "My mother kept this because she thought secrecy kept me safe." Her voice held a concrete image, not an abstraction. She named a market in a town and a baker who had given them bread once. Such details would allow the researcher to verify lineage without broadcasting it. They left the chapel in a cluster. Mira held the lantern high. The last acolyte wrapped the cord round his wrist. Lisa kept the baptismal token beneath her shirt. The researcher walked last and paused at the threshold. He set his notebook on the stone and wrote one last line, "Decision recorded. Custodial deposit with redaction." Cade removed fragment without consent. He underlined the line and took a photograph of his own handwriting. He would use that photograph as part of his legal deposit in the trust. They argued about Cade's motives while they walked to their separate quarters. The last acolyte muttered that archivists sold secrets. Mira, she had known Cade since he catalogued parish records and believed his protest. Lisa stayed silent for a while and then said, "If he sells it, I will find him." The last acolyte answered, "If you do, you will bring more than you expect." The threat was simple and physical. Each line of dialogue was short and loaded with consequence. The researcher returned alone at dawn to the altar room to perform what he called a final inspection. He photographed the robe in situ, touched the iron peg to test that the stitch held, and then placed his notebook on the altar's lip. He checked the sanctum hatch and closed it, turning a small iron key into its lock. The key clicked and the sound confirmed a material closure. As he turned away, he felt the weight of his choice settle into his coat pocket like a stone. He had chosen to protect identity over immediate exposure, and that choice had real costs. Cade's theft, the possibility of future revelation, and the knowledge that the rights mechanism existed and might be used again. He folded the robe's outer cloth once more and then, as a final act, set it down on the altar stone where the initiate had stood decades before. He straightened the cloth so that the hem fell neatly. He placed his pen on top of his notebook and snapped the leather binder shut. He did not write a flourish or a promise. He only noted the time and the decisions made. He left the chapel with the locked hatch, the photograph files encrypted and partly redacted, and a choice: to place a sealed deposit with legal restrictions at an academic trust the next morning. Outside, the sky had gone from slate to pale blue. Cade's footsteps were not behind him. The researcher walked toward the lane where Cade had headed and kept his head down, counting the distance to the research trust in his head, planning the hours needed to set the legal deposit before anyone could intervene. He had made a decision that balanced exposure and protection, and it required procedural follow-through. The chapter ended on a concrete sequence. He locked the hatch, photographed his handwriting, and walked to file the sealed deposit. Those actions closed the immediate dispute and set in motion a bureaucratic safeguard to protect a living line from exploitation. He could not erase the image of the raised ridge on the calf hide, nor the way Lissa pressed the token to her throat. He could not unmake Cade's theft, but he could create a paper chain of custody that would, he hoped, reduce the risk of uncontrolled replication. He had done what he could with the tools he had: measurement, documentation, and legal procedure. He left the chapel with a precise record and a sealed intention. The last scene he recorded before he left was the robe on the altar and the small brass pin he placed to mark the time, a minute and a signature. He closed the research ledger and walked away into the morning with the fragment of the story, now lodged where it could be controlled, not erased.